Hello, everyone. My name is Lori Beth, and this is episode number 20 of Exploring Genuine Transformation. And this is a show where I interview thought leaders, coaches, healers, and therapists in the realm of transformation. And this is a show where we are exploring transformation from the inside out. So transformation for the sake of having more of yourself, for the sake of a better quality of life, you could say, overall, and for the sake of freedom and awakening. And so today I have the great honor and privilege of interviewing Gracy Obuchowicz. Her name is hard for me to pronounce, apparently. On self-care culture. So I am going to bring her on camera and then we'll introduce her more and we'll get started. So here she comes.
Hi, Lori.
Hi. We're trying this for a second time. So here we go.
It's just technology.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great to have you on the show.
So nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I want to take a moment to introduce Gracy, and I'm really excited to have her on the show today. This topic is a really beautiful and needed topic in our world and for everyone. We're going to be talking about self-care culture, and this is what Gracy's work centers around. She is a self-care coach, and she leads retreats, and she has a podcast that's called Self-Care with Gracy. And she also has a book that she wrote called Self-Carefully. And I'm sure that she'll get into talking about all of these. And she leads retreats in self-care all around the world. And she has a very unique way of thinking about self-care as not only being, an individual practice or an individual way of being, but a community process and a community learning, and that it's something that comes from, something that is birthed in our culture in a really particular way. We don't learn self-care, and also something that needs a particular kind of care and revolutionizing, I would say, in our culture, and both in our culture as a whole and for individuals, and they're obviously connected. So I'm going to let Gracy. That's my introduction for now, and we'll learn a lot more about her work as we go along in the interview. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for that introduction. My pleasure to be here and talk about self-care. I always like to start when I talk about my self-care story by saying that I learned most about self-care by growing up in a family that didn't practice a whole lot of self-care.
Yeah.
So there was definitely some addiction issues, definitely some undiagnosed mental illnesses, a lot of codependency. Nobody had words for this at the time. Everyone thought it was just sort of the normal way that families were. And just the same way any of us that are growing up in a dysfunctional environment, I grew up thinking that that was normal, and I just sort of had to play by those rules. But as I got older, I remember looking at certain people in my life and watching them, and they were just doing something different. And they were getting different results from their life. They were having these like fulfilling relationships. They liked themselves. And I definitely did not have the word self-care for it, but it was something that I was like, whatever they're doing, I want more of that. And I didn't know how to get there. And I definitely thought it was about losing weight. That was like a big thing. It was like, if I got my body looking the way that all the magazines said it was, started going on diets when I was like in elementary school. I thought it was about getting good grades. When I got into like high school, it's like, if I could just be like honors student, get into the good college, that I would get there. I thought it was about getting an awesome boyfriend. And it was like all these things, I started to do them and they weren't it. And I first went into a yoga studio when I was in the end of college. And I remember this very visceral sense of like, this is it. Like and it wasn't it, it was just warmer. It was in the direction of what that was, which was self-care. And I began practicing yoga, found it to be so helpful. Yoga got me interested in teaching yoga and sharing that experience with others, which was about being in community. That felt super helpful. And then when I was in my early 30s, I had a very strong drive to study Ayurveda. I didn't know what it was, but I just became obsessed with it, signed up for this immersive program, started to like actually practice the daily routines and rhythms, and everything in my life just changed. I was living with somebody and we were not in a super happy relationship, but we were deluded enough to think that we could make a life out of that. And the moment that I really like sunk into that deep self-care, we just looked at each other and said like, this isn't going to work. And we broke everything up. And just as I was kind of recovering from that, because not only was I going through this huge change, but I had this self-care. So I wasn't totally falling apart and doing that thing I normally did in codependent relationships where I was like, I can't go on without you. I was like, okay, who am I now? And I was curious about that. I was starting to reestablish myself. I found out that my father had cancer. And he was sick for about 8 months before he passed away. And so as you can imagine, that 8 months was a really challenging time in life. And yet I was so in the self-care that I really did start to have words for it at that time. I was like, I'm taking care of myself and I'm putting this first. And it wasn't that I didn't show up for him. It was just that I did my practices. I went to the hospital. I was emotionally available for him. And before he passed away, he said, like, whatever it is you're doing for yourself, he's like, it's making me not worry about you. He's like, I'm worried about everybody else, but I'm not worried about you. So, and it was this profound lesson to show me, I think before I always thought that self-care was selfish. And I think that's the way a lot of us enter into our self-care of like, oh, am I doing this for myself? It's going to take away from somebody else. And it was such a profound moment of life where I realized that self-care was the way that I was giving back to the people around me. It was the way I had enough energy to show up for the people around me. And from there, I just knew that was it. So I've been practicing my own self-care, deepening the definition of that and sharing it with communities, starting with coaching courses. And that has really morphed into retreats and different online communities of mostly women supporting other women and what it means to practice authentic self-care.
Beautiful. Thank you for that story. And I think my first question is really, what would your definition of authentic self-care be for everyone watching? Because I think that word is thrown around, right? And we're not always clear, like what does it actually mean to be in self-care?
Yes, especially since the 2016 elections, I'll say that no one was really talking about it. And then all of a sudden Trump is elected president. Everybody's like, take care of yourself. You got to do self-care. And so I think we have a cultural curiosity around self-care, what it really means. And I think it can never be defined in a sentence. I think it's always a conversation, like what we're doing right now is self-care. Yeah. But there are a few elements of it that are really important. One is distinguishing between numbing behavior and self-care, because a lot of us get very confused on this. So numbing behavior would be, I'm going to drink a couple glasses of wine after a hard day. Numbing behavior would be like, I'm just going to sit on my couch and chill and do Netflix. Numbing behavior would be on social media, maybe dating that person who's kind of thrilling, but like always leaves us feeling a little unstable. And it's the thing that we do in our lives that just turns the volume down on the stress. And so it can feel like self-care in the moment because we get a relief from like what we're dealing with in our lives. But real self-care, it's not just turning the volume down, but it's actually fixing the causes of the stress at the root. And so I always say the metric to use to distinguish between numbing and self-care, because even I get confused in the moment sometimes, is that self-care is something you wake up the next morning and you feel good about yourself for having done it. And numbing is something you wake up the next morning and you're like, should I have had that? Or did I go too far? And that would be numbing. And then the other really big distinction is the difference between self-improvement and self-care. And that is another one that can be very subtle for a lot of us, but I think is actually a huge difference. And what self-improvement comes from my perspective, is a perfectionistic mindset. we live in a very perfectionistic culture. We're told that if we just kind of like polish the edges of ourselves enough, that we are going to get to a point where we're better people. And I know your work, Lori Beth, and I know that like your whole thing is about like the edges and getting in there. But I think a lot of us still think that we just need to make that bad stuff go away. And then we're going to be worthy of self-care in some way. And we'll take care of ourselves once we kind of like fix all of that. And so that is rooted in the idea that it's on a flawed premise that there's something in us that even needs to be fixed, and that the bad, quote unquote, bad stuff is what's holding us back. And self-care is a much more radical, compassionate response in the moment, that no matter how hard things are, no matter how many edges we're finding, that we're still worthy of care. And what I found for myself and so many of my clients is that when we do just choose to practice self-care in the moment, that we find that there's really not that much about ourselves that we need to fix. It's more about getting curious, digging in, finding the richness there, letting ourselves be whole beings and show up as whole beings. So those two distinctions, I think, help to really distinguish what self-care is.
Well, it's interesting, even as you kind of reference my work, because to me, that is the healing, right? Because you're showing up for it and you're facing it and you're caring for yourself and you're accepting yourself, right? That radical self-acceptance. Actually, there is a lot of healing in that, because instead of sort of like continually trying to run from something or improve yourself, or like you said, numbing out and then not feeling good the next day, you're actually kind of opening to the truth of your experience and being with it and caring for yourself within that. So it's really beautiful. I mean, there seems to be a lot of overlaps, obviously. When one can really be in true self-care, there's a lot of natural healing that happens. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think the places that scare us inside of ourselves, once we investigate them through self-care, which isn't about just letting destructive patterning carry on. It's really about setting boundaries with ourselves. But being curious, I think we find that all of our strengths have these shadow counterparts, and that we can't just cut parts of ourselves off.
Yeah, and I really.
But the issue is that we've been sold this idea that we can and that we should, and that's where a lot of us get stuck.
Yeah, and what's so beautiful about what you just said also is that, self-care is, I mean, it's a practice. It's something that's ongoing. It's not about, oh, I just went and took a bath right now. It's actually more of the beingness and the quality that you're taking the bath with, right? Or that you're kind of giving yourself, which is why I think, even the example of numbing, it doesn't really work, because maybe there's a sort of like, you might be numbing out by doing something and you feel good momentarily, but then the backlash of that. So it's more about a quality of being, which I really love, because I think we hear a lot about self-care as like, do these things and then you'll be caring for yourself and then you'll feel better. But your work is really centered around, it sounds like, it's a way of being. It's a way of being, like, of meeting ourselves. And then, as you'll go on in this interview and share about some of the community work that you do, it's a way of also meeting others and being a support for others. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. The checklists, they don't really work. I do believe in routines and habits and stabilizing forces, because we need to get grounded enough to even understand what we need sometimes. But then from there, it's all self-care. Like hanging out with all my friends is self-care. Staying in and taking introvert time is self-care. Those things are going to be at odds. So I think self-care is about having a way to organize information and really make values-based decisions based on like what you need in the moment, and knowing how to check in with yourself.
Beautiful. Yeah, and that in and of itself, I think, you were saying at the beginning that you work a lot with women. That's a revolutionary act for women, I think, for all of us in our culture, but, especially women, like, okay, I'm going to check in with myself and and learn myself, know what I need to do in this moment to be in self-care, so that I can then be with others and also in the world, in a way that feels healthy and feels generative. And I love what you said earlier about, your own story. It just reminds me of that, of like, self-care for you would, in your own journey has not just been it's not just about kind of like, oh, I'm doing this for myself. It's like it then trickles out into the relationship you choose, and the way you choose to be gentle with yourself and compassionate with yourself or not, or all the activities that you do throughout your day. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm a mother. I have a 2-year-old right now and another child on the way in February. And I see the direct like correlation between how I am, my own levels of stress, how willing I am to be present, how willing I am to just engage mindfully with conflicts, and how that translates to his own mood. And I'm like, he's a toddler, so I can see it more clearly because he's wearing his emotional body. That is his body right now. But I'm like, we're all doing that to people all the time. And it's about taking a sense of leadership and responsibility for how we show up in the world.
Mm-hmm. Can you say more about that last piece, how self-care is about taking leadership and responsibility for how we show up? Just extrapolate on it, because it's a great concept. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting because all of the things I've learned about self-care, it wasn't like I had a theory about self-care and was like, I'm going to prove this. It was just things that started to happen when my clients went through the work. And I was like, it was just that people were having much bigger transformations than I intended. Like the original program I put together was like, let's work on 10 habits. It was about helping people learn how to establish Ayurvedic-based daily rhythms. And I wanted to do it in a group format because I thought that would be interesting. We read a Brene Brown book too, because I just read it and I was like, that's awesome. And then at the end of 10 weeks, people were like, I'm ready to like move cities. I've been like stuck on this for so long and I'm ready to commit to this relationship. I want to become a mother. It was like people were having these huge clarity breakthroughs. And so a lot of these past few years has been me just kind of like trying to like understand what it is. And I think that as you said, it's like we have to understand in order to practice self-care what we need. And that means we have to slow down. We have to start to distinguish what are other people's opinions about what we should be doing with our life. And a lot of those are just very unconscious societal messages, and what's actually important to me. How do I like put the boundaries in place for me to begin practicing that in my life, hook up to like my actual like self, which some of us have like lived alongside ourselves for years and not really taken the time to get to know what that even means or who we are or what we even like. And then it was just this wild thing that like once people did that, it was just like everything started to change. And I think part of that is that we need to have grounded practices because as we tap into like who we really are, there's a lot of purpose in there. There's a lot of energy in there. And the momentum is there and waiting for us to take us. But we need to have self-care to kind of sustain that. And I think another part of it is it's just who we are, it's like once we're in touch with that, like we want to show up for each other. I do believe that at the heart of all people, there is like a compassionate heart that cares. And I think a lot of the problems in this world are not because people don't care. I think it's because they care way too much and they've put huge blocks up to that because they don't know how to handle the emotional weight of that. I think there are a lot of very highly sensitive, empathetic people out there, empathic people. And so self-care is about, once we have the boundaries in place, I think we can begin to access those places of care in ourselves. And then we have enough energy. It's like once I'm resourced and I have enough, I naturally want to give to you. And that's another way that I measure self-care is if I am experiencing it in the moment and I have an impulse to want to share that experience with somebody else, then that's a good sign that it's self-care because it's generative, as you said.
So beautiful. I love that. Yeah. That's a really, really great way of saying that. And even the barometer system of knowing, like, oh, I'm actually feeling like I want to contribute and I'm feeling good about myself, that those are actually the measures of self-care, and knowing that we're actually caring for ourselves so that we can then be in the world and be a member of life, It's almost like when we don't have self-care, then we can go into, it's another way of being isolated, and it's another way of not actually being in touch, like you said, with the kind of fullness and wholeness and compassion that we feel for life.
Yeah, which can be intense. And I'm in a moment of my life right now where I'm just in so much community. It's like being in the family and being a mother. And I'm like, oh, I see why I kind of kept myself from this for so many years and was more isolated because it's intense. And so it does take knowing what I need in the moment and being able to say no. And just a lot of the skills that I know, especially as women, it's hard because we're not given role modeling and how to practice those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Um, so I'm curious, I mean, this is I'm loving this conversation. And I know you have a really kind of particular model that you use with the groups of people that you work with. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that. I know you have a model that I think has 3 levels of self-care.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm like kind of like the least linear person in many ways, but I think it's helpful to have like 3 things to share with people in a conversation. And these are coming from direct experience that I think when we're looking at self-care, we have to look at 3 elements, and they're all important, and they're all going to be important in different ways at different times. But the first is around bodily self-care, which is where I think we have a societal understanding about that now. Like self-care is like, did you sleep? Are you eating well? How are you exercising? How does your body feel? And that is never not going to be important. Like it's a really important thing because as I said before, if we aren't taking care of our bodies, we're not grounded enough to even access a lot of the other information a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And so establishing daily routines, rhythms is really important. I think a lot of us are not taught how to do that in a very sane way. A lot of us use kind of like a very willpower based model of like, I'm going to like wake up January 1st and everything's going to be different about me. So I'm a big believer in small, gentle changes that like actually come from a sense of joy rather than pushing ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself can be very healing to realize like we can go slow, we can go smaller, and that it actually can be very effective. So I work a lot with my clients on how to be just smarter and how we work with our inner layer of self-care, which is a little harder to talk about, especially in our culture and society in the United States, because we don't value the inner life quite as much. Mm-hmm. And so it's about self-awareness, understanding why it is I do what I do. We were talking before about like willingness to explore edges and shadows and the hard stuff that we're told that we shouldn't have in the first place. And if we have it, we should just make it go away. And that takes vulnerability. Vulnerability is, I really love the work of Brene Brown and just, I think for so long I saw like perfectionism as my strength and vulnerability as my weakness. And now that is like so reversed itself that perfectionism is like the thing I always have to watch for because that's what sucks the joy out of my life. And vulnerability, even though it's always going to feel uncomfortable to practice, that when I can be vulnerable, especially within a group setting and other people and let other people in, that is how I experience joy in my life. And then I think with all of that, that's like emotional intelligence of understanding that our emotions have values. And I imagine a lot of your people who tune into your work understand that. But I think for a lot of people in our society, that inner layer just doesn't feel that available, probably because it is threatening to go there if we don't have the support that we need to go into those spaces. And then once those 2 places are intact, and I had a good idea when I started coaching people that they were both important, the 3rd layer emerges. And this is the one that I just completely learned about from my clients and the work that we did together and continue to do, is the community layer of self-care. And that is about, I think before I thought like, this is a thing I'm going to figure out for myself. And it's going to, like you said at the beginning, it's going to make me a better person. And that is not transformation that's really effective. Like it's transformation for the sake of the ego. And transformation for the sake of being more available to life happens, in my opinion, in community. And part of that is like getting the support that we need. And then for a lot of us out there, that is like choosing people of the emotional development that we really need to be met at. There's a saying in 12-step recovery that I love, which is don't go to the hardware store to buy milk. And that has been a huge layer of self-care. It's like you need to find the people in your life that are like going to give you milk, that want to have these deep discussions, that can handle nuance, that really support you in your self-care. If your group of friends goes and does happy hour every night and you know that drinking is like detracting from your self-care, like that's going to be an issue. And so it's about mindfully choosing the communities that want you to grow, that want you to develop, and aligning yourself with them. And then the last part of the community is really around commonality. And this is like just opened up a whole other world when I realized this, that if all of us are sitting around in a circle and talking about how we're so hard on ourselves, that we feel stressed out all the time, we're anxious, we're depressed, then all of a sudden we have to look at it and be like, is that my personal problem, or is that is that something else? Because we're all feeling that way. And if all of us are like intelligent, compassionate, open-hearted people, and we're all suffering so much, that might mean that there's something in the water instead of like, my metabolism is wrong. And it's in that place that I think the self-care, we really have an opportunity to take the self-care beyond the self. That we see, like, if like there's a reason that we feel that way. We're set up in a way that we like don't have the support that we need. We're not allowed to talk about our true feelings. We're told that our worth is based on how much money we can earn, how hot we look. We're not valuing the inner life. And then at that point, once we realize that, one, it lessens the effect that those subtle but really powerful influences can have on us in our self-care. And it also provides the opportunity for us to begin to, like, as you said, create a revolution and start to change it.
Yeah, I really am drawn to this component of your work. And, you know, when we kind of had our check-in before this call, I think that's just, I mean, what you're speaking to is so important. And it's something that I think about a lot also, you know, obviously with mental health and with, you know, like, let's say the rampant, like all the depression that's happening, right? Like, it's not just that individuals are experiencing depression. It's like we live in a culture in which, you know, there's a lot of, let's say, isolation or not feeling feelings or, you know, that's leading to depression. So it sounds like that's really the kind of the core. I'm just giving depression as an example, but that's really the core of the work that you're doing with self-care, which is like, it's both it's both helping people to kind of see the places within themselves that they're not practicing self-care, and also where that might be internalized from the culture, and then how to shift that both in their individual lives, which I think is revolutionary, just when we can show up in that way, because then, right, we're modeling it for other people. But then also in the groups that you're doing, you know, that then people are like shifting it in a group, and then potentially can take it out and shift it even further in a societal way. So it just feels like, I mean, I love what you said. It's like self-care beyond the self. That we could have titled it. We could have titled this talk that.
Yeah. It's a process, you know, that once we get to that place, that it can start to feel really overwhelming, I think, because then we have to start looking at society itself. And its society, it wasn't formed overnight. There are a lot of people that are benefiting from things not working. And then it's not so easy to make a change and see a result. Like, I think in our own personal self-care, it's like, all right, I went to bed earlier, I'm feeling better, gold stars. And some days I kind of like, in my like overwhelmed days, I'm like, I wish it just stopped there. I wish I hadn't taken whatever the pill was in the Matrix. It's like, 'cause once you start to see it, it's like, oh man, we have a lot of work to do. And it's not work that can be done in my lifetime or your lifetime. Like, this is like intergenerational deep work. And yet there's such a responsibility I think each one of us has once we start to have these realizations of like, why is society not working? How can my response be positive and beneficial, not just for myself, but for future generations? And how do I like continue to practice the self-care that I need to go into that space? Because I think what a lot of people do is once they start to go in that space, they go back into self-neglect. And I look at a lot of activist communities who see it, and they see it really clearly, and they are just diminishing themselves the whole way, I think, because it brings up so many feelings of how am I supposed to take the time to care for myself when people are suffering so much in this world. And yet that's the key, I think, to really creating a true revolution, is that our self-care affects those around us, and us showing up, not in the way that we take 2-hour bubble baths every day and, you know, make our own like emotional needs more important than anyone else's around us, and that we know how to regulate ourselves. We know how to direct the thing that we're here to do into the holes that are existent in society. We know how to practice discretion to say, like, I mean, there's so many amazing volunteer opportunities I've had to say no to lately, and they're organizations I care deeply about, and I know they're not using my gifts. And so it's about not letting go of like the quote unquote good person, and really thinking about like what gives me energy, what gives me life, where can I put myself in where I feel like I can actually make a change, and how do I not get super overwhelmed by this not getting cleared up tomorrow, because that's like my perfectionism. I'm like, but I want to fix it now. And I'm like, no, this is a slow process. This is going to take time, and it's going to take support of other people just like walking alongside me in the path too.
Well, I love what you just shared too, because it's really about the inner and the outer meeting. And that, you know, when I like I think most really genuine transformation, which is what the name of this show is, you know, is a slower, more patient process. Like that's part of it. It's, you know, I think it's like, how does that, you know, kind of, can we be in it for the long haul, you know, and can we be connected to ourselves and also connected to, you know, the larger, like others and the world as a whole, and where are the intersections of, you know, how that healing can happen on the planet and individually. And so I love your work because I really feel like you're bringing it together in that way. And then the last thing I would also say about it is that I think that because, you know, you're focused on self-care, in my opinion, as a transformational and revolutionary practice. And yet I think it is way farther reaching than some of the other, I mean, I think therapy is far reaching, for example, but, you know, things like certain spiritual practices or, you know, certain very niche ways of, you know, I don't know, like helping women rise in a certain way. Like those are not going to touch all communities. And I feel like self-care is something that everybody can kind of understand. And yet the way that you're doing it, I feel like is a deeper spiritual and societal practice. So there's something that's really incredible about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. It feels like we're in this powerful moment of integration right now, where it is like people have been like sitting on the mat and sitting on the cushion for the past, you know, generation. There are a lot of people that came before me that went to India that like found these practices that brought them back, that started teaching people. And I really resist cynicism around like, oh, well, you know, this is just a bunch of people sitting on the mat. I'm like, those are my time on that yoga mat was so important for me to like just start to self-regulate and turn inward. But then it's just like, and then what, you know, like once we do that, once we touch in, like what's there. And I think the process of integration is, we just need to create more vocabulary around it and understand what that means of like, how can that be true? And then also this be true at the same time. And for a lot of people out there in the spiritual path, and I was this way for so long, was just understanding what spiritual bypass is. And I think I just wanted to pretend that I could just be on my yoga mat and working on myself, and that all the answers were spiritual ones, and that was enough. And then, you know, really it was 2016 when Trump got elected, and I was like, what just happened here? That like, it was like, I came out of denial in a big way. And yet it was like, and all of that has to come with me. So how do we take everything that's come before us, everything that we've learned, and then start to translate that into meaningful action around it too?
Thank you. We're gonna end there because that feels like a really beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for coming on the show and just your beautiful work in the world. I would love for people who are watching to be able to follow you and your podcast, and you know about your book and any other offerings that you have. So do you want to share those?
Yeah. First, thank you so much for having me, and your amazing questions and your thoughtful reflections and the work that you're doing and making space for these conversations, because you're spreading it. So thank you so much. And I'd love to stay in touch with anyone who feels called to this kind of work. My website is selfcarewithgracy.com. And that's Gracy with a Y. And there you can find links to my podcast, which is called Self-Care with Gracy. You can search for it on iTunes as well. I interview a lot of great thinkers and thought leaders in the self-care world. Lori Beth's going to be on my podcast tomorrow. Very excited about that. And I offer programs that are virtual and programs that are in person and retreats. So I always try to keep those updated on my website so you can check out whatever the offerings are. And then I just wrote a book, I really love that you have video here because most of the time on a podcast, I can't like show people. But the thing about this book, it's called Self Carefully. And it's actually a collaborative book between an independent press, which is dedicated to creating materials for caregivers or people who care in the world, and just a really amazing yogi and designer and illustrator. And so it's called Self Carefully, and it's about how to use our self-care and bring it into any situation. And there are 30 vignettes, and each one has a title that says self-care and. So this one is self-care and consumption, all about like our consumption habits. There's self-care and caregiving. And as you can see, if you're watching this, each one of them is just like, just illustrated with so much love. Self-care and the patriarchy. And it's risograph printed, which is a special kind of printing where it actually like smudges just a tiny bit when you touch it. And we really wanted people to have this experience of not just reading about self-care, but actually feeling the care that went into this book. And then using it to discuss, because all of this in here, it's fodder for like conversations in your break room at work, with your best friend when she's going through a hard time, with your parents, you know, when you want to like help understand them more. And so the concepts, we say it's like a book to like hold in your hands or give to a friend. And for those who are interested in learning more about that, you can go to my website. You can also order the book through thickpress.com. And it's actually coming out. You can get an early edition copy right now, but it's coming out at the end of November. And it's been picked up by a small press distributor. So it will be available on Amazon then. We've been trying to like resist Amazon, but you can't really resist Amazon. We like are having a book out there in the world.
Thank you so much. And I'm excited that you just shared more about the book and kind of the illustration and, you know, just the care and love that went into it. So I definitely highly recommend checking the book out for anyone who's watching. And once again, my name is Lori Beth, and this show happens every single week. And I interview all kinds of different thought leaders and coaches and healers, all in the realm of transformation, all on completely different topics, which is really exciting because we get to kind of hear about all aspects of life from the inside out. I am a psychotherapist and an embodiment and empowerment coach for women and girls. That is my passion, is working with women. And I'm also a somatic and trauma healer. And so currently I am offering one-on-one work, and my work really focuses on what I call awakening soul power from the darkness. So it's really about being able to go into places that you've avoided or have been hard to look at, you know, old wounds and traumas, and do the deep healing work that's necessary in order to have more of yourself and to really step into your true power and your passions in life, and to be able to, you know, have the confidence and the also, you know, being fully in your body to live the life that you truly desire. So if you're interested in working with me, you can reach out to me, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much, Gracie. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Larva. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.